Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you, and welcome to today's true crime episode. I am so happy that you are here. I am so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day-to-day, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the murder of 16-year-old Heather Rich. When I was researching this case, I read an article that I feel like perfectly captures what this case is about, and it was written by a reporter who was covering the case at the time that it happened. His name was Mike, I believe. And he said of this case, and I quote, "Heather's journey to Belknap Creek is a saga of restless and rootless kids, of sex, booze, and betrayal, of violence, repentance, and forgiveness, all played out in the rural Red River country straddling the Oklahoma-Texas border. It also appears to be a story of how one young man found courage too late. Too late to save Heather, too late to save himself, but just in time to change the course of justice." But before we get into all the details of today's case, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. And speaking of the Brat Pack, this is a case that was actually recommended to me by several members of the Brat Pack. It was Melissa, it was Heather, it was Amber, it was Anne, and it was, wait for it, Before You Become Old was the username. So thank you to all of you for your recommendation. So with that, today I'm going to tell you the story of the murder of Heather Rich. I read all the things so that you do not have to. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer the question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it kicking around in your brain as we go through the details of this case. But of course, I want you to answer once you have something to go on, okay? And the question of the day is this: which of the men arrested and convicted for Heather's murder do you believe was the mastermind, the trigger man? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through the details of this case. And now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murder of 16-year-old Heather Rich. Our case today is going to begin on October 10th, 1996, and it's this day that a farmer was walking across a bridge that went over the Red River that connected Texas to Oklahoma. Apparently, the border between Texas and Oklahoma is one of the most rural and least populated areas in America. And there is a Red River cutting between the two states. And on either side is tons of farmland. And most people who lived in this area were just good working class people. So anyways, this man, he's walking across the bridge. He's looking out into the water, and it's really like dirty, murky water. It really should be called like the Brown River, not the Red River. But that aside, when he's looking out into the water, he sees something sort of floating there, and it's tangled between like some brush and some fallen down limbs. Now, at first, what he thought he was seeing was a baby cow that had fallen into the water and drowned, because again, there's a lot of farmland on either side of the river, so that wouldn't be super uncommon to see. And because that's what he thought it was, this is super horrifying, but he actually took out the gun he was carrying, which was a .22 caliber, and he shot 2 rounds into what he thought was a baby cow in hopes that it would sink and it wouldn't be floating on the water anymore. The next day, the farmer was on the bridge again, and when he looked out into the water, he saw that whatever he had seen the day before was still there. So he decided this time to get a closer look. And when he did, he quickly realized that what he was seeing was not a baby cow and was instead a body that was mostly submerged in the water, and just like the leg at this point was sticking out. With that, police were immediately called to the scene. They showed up to the bridge where the man was, and they could tell just standing on the bridge that something violent had happened there, because there was evidence of a struggle. There was blood on the bridge, and it was clear somebody had tried to conceal it by like kicking dirt over the blood, but they had done a pretty shitty job. The body was pulled from the water, and when they looked at the body at first, it was really hard to tell much because it was just in such bad shape. But with time, they were able to determine that this was the body of a girl, and like a younger girl, a teenage girl. And she had been brutalized, okay? She had been shot to death, and not just shot to death, but she was shot 9 times, okay? And most of the shots were to her back or her backside. She was shot like in her legs, in her buttock, in her shoulders, and in the back of her head. It was determined that whoever had shot her had used a high-power shotgun, and apparently most shotguns carry 8 rounds, but she was shot 9 times. So that meant either this was a different type of shotgun than usual, or somebody had taken the time to reload. And they were able to tell from the scene that the type of ammo that was used were Winchester rounds, like Winchester buckshot. Now, one of the officers working the scene who was there when the body was found had a sneaking suspicion that they had an idea of who this was, because they knew that in a neighboring town, there was a missing 16-year-old girl, a cheerleader who hadn't been seen in a week. She had last been seen at her house on October 2nd, 1996, and when her parents realized she wasn't home, they reported her missing, and she was described as last being seen as wearing a gray shirt and shorts. She was very small. She was like 5'2", 100 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes, and this girl was Heather Rich. Now, Heather Rich was born to her parents. Her father's name was Lloyd, but he went by his middle name, Dwayne, and her mother's name was Gail. And she was born on January 19th, 1980. She was the one girl, the second youngest child, with 3 brothers who she was said to have loved and tormented. She was a beautiful, intelligent, popular girl from a good, loving home, and she was a typical girl, but there's also just something special about her. She was the type of person who entered a room and all eyes were immediately on her. She was beautiful. She was vivacious. She laughed easily. She got a lot of attention from boys, which is something that she loved, but her 3 brothers, who were all football players, really did not like. She was said to always be one that was cutting it up. She was always laughing, and she was very wild. She was a wild child, and she was down to do anything. She was said to be incredibly fearless. She loved music. She was said to be very talented in music. She also loved horses and talking to her friends on the phone and her church and just life in general. She was the type of person who loved life and had this ability to reach out and touch people's hearts and touch people's lives. She and her family lived in Waurika, Oklahoma after moving to the area just a few years before Heather was born. Apparently, they actually moved to this area because they wanted to raise their children in a safer place. And right before they had moved, one of their neighbors had unfortunately, one of their female neighbors had been assaulted. So they wanted to go somewhere where they could keep their kids safe, and Waurika seemed like the perfect place for them to go to because it was this really rural area that was very community oriented, and there wasn't a lot of trouble for the kids to get into because there wasn't really much going on there. Waurika was a tiny community of just about 2,000 people, and it was a place that didn't really have much to offer teenagers specifically, right? There was no movie theaters, no malls. There wasn't even a coffee shop. Teens really had to do whatever they could to kill the time, which often led to some less than ideal choices being made, but we'll get into that a bit later. Overall, though, this area just seemed to have safe, small-town vibes, and this is where Heather and her family were living at the time she was killed. Heather was a sophomore at Waurika, that word. I also hope I'm saying that right. If you're from the area, Waurika, Waurika High School. She was a sophomore. She was a cheerleader, and she was even voted as the sophomore class favorite. She was bubbly. She went out of her way to be nice to everyone, and she was just the type of person who saw the good in everyone and didn't ever expect that anyone around her would have anything but good intentions. So the night Heather disappeared. Okay, basically the night Heather disappeared is quite unfortunate because she and her mother had gotten into a bit of an argument. I guess Heather had run the phone bill up and run it up quite high. It was at $300, and in 90s dollars, I can't even imagine. I would be pretty pissed off if I was her mom too. And so this was something that, her mother was pretty upset about. And to be fair, her mom was already kind of upset with her in general because recently Heather had been kind of rebelling a little bit. And shortly before this happened, I think just days, maybe 2 days before this happened, Heather and another cheerleader had actually gotten suspended from school, and Heather had been kicked off the cheerleading team because during a high school football game / pep rally, are pep rallies always related to football games? I really am not sure. But during that situation, Heather and this girl had been caught drinking. They were drunk at school. Now, when Heather had gotten suspended, they were pretty shocked because they didn't know that Heather did drink. Yes, she's 16 and a lot of 16-year-olds drink, but they didn't know that about her, right? They knew that she had been getting into a bit of trouble because she was the type of girl who was very, very into her look. She was beautiful, and she was the type of girl who took pride in her appearance. She always did her hair. She did her makeup. She plucked her eyebrows within an inch of their lives to make sure that they were the shape that she wanted. But in that strive for perfection, she also had developed a bit of an eating disorder and would make herself vomit and things like that. And so her parents knew that she had something going on. And now they knew it was even worse because in addition to the eating disorder, they now knew that she was drinking, and she was drinking at school. And after the suspension and during an altercation when they were talking about it, they learned that she wasn't only drinking, she had also been dabbling here and there in drugs and had been cutting herself. So her parents were really worried about her, and it even made her an appointment with like a mental health professional because they wanted to see what was going on with her. And it was scheduled for the next day, October 3rd. They just wanted to make sure she was okay because, again, right before she was killed, Heather had just, she started acting out. She was in an age where this can already happen, right? 16 is when that happens, but her life had also been thrown into a bit of a tailspin recently because her father had gotten really badly hurt at work. Like, he was an electrician and a transformer blew up, like literally blew up, and he got burned really badly and was out of work. So her mom ended up having to be the person who was now supporting the family. In order to do this, her mother had bought a Subway franchise, and because it was like her business, she worked constantly to try to keep it afloat, and Heather also worked at the Subway to try to help make ends meet as well. On top of that, when her mom was at work, Heather would be the person responsible for helping to take care of her father, who was in very bad shape due to the fact that he was, had most of his body burned in that like explosion essentially. So Heather was just sort of seeming to rebel against her newfound responsibility that she didn't have before this accident happened, and she was just acting out. They knew she would sneak out of the house, but now they knew that she was drinking, she was smoking, she was dabbling in drugs, and she was cutting herself. And it turns out she was just kind of getting into more of like a party phase in general, though she was also an extreme lightweight, and just after like 1 or 2 beers, she'd be kind of stumbling on her feet. But anyways, the point of all of that is 1, to give you backstory, and 2, to let you know that when Heather and her mom had this argument the night before she went missing, things were already pretty raw between them. So they argued. It really didn't go anywhere because, like, how often do arguments actually go somewhere? And it ended with Heather's mom telling her that all she did was cost her mom money, which is unfortunately one of the last things she ever said to her daughter, which is, I'm sure you can imagine, is something that she very much regrets now. After the fight, Heather got ready for bed and then came into her parents' room and made a big show and a big production out of only telling her father goodnight. She told him goodnight, gave him a hug, told him that she loved him, and then made it abundantly clear on her way out the door that she wasn't going to be saying the same thing to her mother, which, if you've been a teenage girl or been around a teenage girl, this is not entirely uncommon behavior. And then as far as her parents knew, she went to bed. But what they didn't know is that once the coast was clear, she actually snuck out her bedroom window. The next morning, her parents went in to wake her up for school, and they found that she was not there. Her room was empty, the bed was made, and it didn't appear that it had been slept in because she wasn't the type of girl who's going to like immediately make her bed in the morning. That wasn't really her vibe. And this made her parents immediately panic because it wasn't unusual for Heather to sneak out. They knew that she had been doing that recently, but it was incredibly unusual for her not to be home the next day. Like, she'd sneak out, but she'd always come back. There was never a morning when she wasn't there ready to go to school. So with that, her parents went over to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department to report their daughter missing. They told them what she looked like. They told them what she had been wearing and some specific things one would use to know it was her, like the fact that she wore braces or the fact that she always wore a specific ring. It was a ring that had a heart on it and a little jewel in the center, a little diamond in the center, and it was a gift that she had actually recently got for her 16th birthday. When the police spoke to Gail and Dwayne, they told the police all about the night before, all about what had happened, and all about the fight that Heather had had with her mother. And as soon as they heard that Heather and Gail had gotten into a fight, they immediately I don't want to say dismissed, but kind of dismissed her parents' worry. They were like, okay, you got in a fight with your teenage daughter that often sneaks out of the house. It's a good chance that she's not missing. She's just gone. She's blowing off steam and she's going to come back. So you should just sit at home and you should wait. I'm sure she's going to come back. And this didn't sit right with her parents, right? They knew her. They knew how she responded emotionally to situations and how she would conduct herself. And on top of that, they knew that this was a girl, this was their daughter, who was very into her looks, yet she didn't take her makeup bag, which she took with her everywhere. Can relate. At 16, I carried enough makeup with me to completely put on a full face of makeup if for whatever reason that was necessary. They also found that none of her clothes were missing, and also her diary was left open on her bed. What 16-year-old girl would do that? None of them. That's the answer. And so Gail told the officer that she was speaking to, quote, "When your daughter's missing, you can sit home and wait." So feeling they were not going to get the immediate response from police that they wanted, Heather's parents decided to start looking for her themselves. They started doing their own little investigation. They started driving around and looking for her. They started calling all of her friends. And one of the friends that they called was her ex-boyfriend. This was a guy named Randy. And when they spoke to Randy, they asked him if he had seen Heather, if he had heard from Heather, and he said no. And they asked him if he would lie to them, if he knew where she was and she was like hiding and didn't want to be found, and he said no. But they didn't really believe him. They didn't believe that he was telling the truth. They thought he sounded like robotic and rehearsed in his responses, and thought there was just kind of like no real emotion in his voice. But even though they didn't think that he was telling the truth, he didn't give them any useful information, so they just kind of needed to move on to the next person. And the next person they were going to be moving on to was Heather's most recent crush. This was a 17-year-old guy named Josh. Josh went to school with Heather, went to school with Randy. They all knew each other. And what? Oh, he lived with his grandma, and they knew where his grandma lived, okay? So they drive over to go and try to speak to Josh. And when they get there, they find that his grandma is there, and she tells them that Josh is asleep. She says that Josh and his friends had been partying in a trailer that was on the property the night before, and she was actually in the process of cleaning up the trailer when they got there, because like boys can't be bothered to clean up after themselves. And so she tells them, like, listen, he was partying, he's sleeping it off, he's not awake, but I can tell you for sure that he didn't see Heather. He was partying with his boys. So after speaking to the two boys that Heather would be most likely to be in contact with, because it was her ex Randy, who she was still pretty close with, and the guy that she was currently interested in, and not getting any information from them and not getting any information from any of the friends that they called either, her parents were just forced to kind of sit home and wait. There wasn't much more they could do at this point. They did hire a private investigator pretty quickly after she went missing because they wanted to try to find out anything they could, but they ended up not finding much out about Heather and found out more about the town as a whole, and found out that there's like a lot of drug activity going on in Waurika. Like Eureka, the drag queen. But no, Waurika. And yeah, they found out that there was just like a lot of drug activity, which was like news to them because they moved to this area for a safer place. And now they're finding out that there's like meth labs on every corner and people selling drugs all over the place. But that aside, they didn't have much to go on, so they just had to wait. Hours turned into days. Days eventually turned into a week, and by this time, Heather's family isn't the only person who, Heather's parents were not the only people, rather, who were worried that something bad had happened to Heather. By this point, the police were now involved. They were involved in the searches because, enough time had gone by now that the police didn't think she was just, off blowing off some steam. And as we know, she was not blowing off some steam, and her body was found in that river in Texas, miles and miles away from her home. And the night that her body was found, her father had to come and identify her body, and he had to identify her body based on that ring that they had told the police about, the ring she was wearing at the time she was killed, because her body was in such bad condition that they were never able to actually see her. But the body was also later identified by dental records, so it definitely was her. And after he went and he looked at the ring, he told the police that, yes, this was the body of his 16-year-old daughter. And then he'd have to go home and give his wife this horrific news. She said that she knew as soon as she saw his face that Heather was gone, and that when he walked in the door, she told him, like, come on, just tell me, let's just get it over with, just say it. And then he told her that Heather was gone, that she had been shot and she had been thrown in the river. And in response, Gail just lost it. She went into shock. She started screaming. And then she just, for like an hour, she says, continued just like hitting her husband over and over, just saying like, no, no, no. The next day, the news of Heather's body being found started to spread around the small town, and people were shocked. They were scared. This really wasn't a place where things like this happened. When the news got to her school, all of her friends, all of her peers were just in disbelief that somebody they knew, so somebody that they saw every day, right? Like already when you're young and somebody in your school dies, it's so shocking, but this is such a small area, so there are so few people, so they really do all know each other. And they were just shocked, I guess, when Randy, her ex-boyfriend, learned that her body had been found, he said that his world just stopped. The day that her body was found, I guess there was the like annual homecoming game situation, and Heather was actually nominated to be homecoming queen, and Randy, her ex, won homecoming king. So it was a very bittersweet moment because there were these highs of like, oh my gosh, winning homecoming, but then these lows of learning that her body was found in the river. And he said because of that, instead of enjoying this day, he was mentally on that bridge with Heather. After Heather's body was found, a joint homicide task force was created that included officers from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the Texas State Rangers, the Monte County Sheriff's Office, and because Heather was taken across state lines, presumably kidnapped, the FBI eventually became involved as well. They wanted to start investigating immediately, but logically they were like, where do we even begin? Because who could have possibly wanted to hurt this innocent 16-year-old girl? In order to try to figure this out, the first thing they had to do was look at the scene. And from looking at the scene, they were able to tell two things. One was that she was brutalized. Whoever did this, it was clearly overkill. There was some sort of anger there because of how many times she had been shot. And they were also able to tell that whatever happened to her happened within like the first couple hours of when she went missing, because they were able to tell by looking at her and the condition of her body that she had been in the water like that entire week. So that meant they needed to figure out where she went that night when she snuck out of the house. And in order to figure that out, they went and spoke to the family. And one of the very few things that they were able to get from the family was actually from one of Heather's little brothers. So basically, Heather's little brother had noticed Heather and her mom fighting that night, right? Because he was being a little nosy brother. And he's like, oh, she's in trouble. Let's listen. Let's watch, right? So he sees that she's in trouble. And he sees that after fighting with her mom at around 10 p.m., Heather went and got on the phone. Now, when Heather got off the phone, her little brother, again being nosy, was like, who was that you were talking to? And she told him that she had been speaking to Carly, and Carly was her best friend. She was also a cheerleader, went to the same school. They were super close. So police are thinking this is an interesting bit of information, but they need to corroborate it. So they pull the family's phone records, and they do see that a call was received. The house received a phone call at around 10 p.m. So they're like, okay, cool. She was on the phone, and maybe it was to her friend Carly, but they couldn't say for sure because what they noticed is that the phone that called her phone was a payphone. This call came from a payphone because the dream of the 90s was alive in the 90s. So police needed to confirm whether or not it was Carly who Heather was speaking to that night, and then needed to figure out if that phone call was at all related to what happened to her. Though it did seem like it likely was related because of the fact that it happened right before she went missing. So presumably whoever she talked to, maybe she was meeting that person. And it seemed weird that the call came from a payphone specifically, because it seemed like, why are you going through this layer of secrecy by calling from a payphone so you can't be traced kind of thing? This is what they're thinking because they're cops. But first, they need to figure out if it even was Carly she was speaking to. So cops go to Carly's house, and they actually first speak to Carly's mom. And Carly's mom tells them that there's no way that Carly was talking to Heather on the phone because Carly was grounded and she didn't have access to the phone. But the cops are like, I don't know, teenagers can lie sometimes and they can do things they're not supposed to. So they speak to Carly and they ask, was she talking to you? Did she sneak out of the house? Did she meet you? What's the situation? And she says, no. She says, no, she was not speaking to me. I did not call her that night. I also was not with her. I am grounded. That didn't happen. And so they're like, okay, well, that's a bust. But they're like, oh, you are her best friend, though. So do you have any idea who she may have talked to, who she may have snuck out of the house to see? And she said that she could only think of two people who that may be. And it was one, her ex-boyfriend, Randy, or two, her new crush, Josh, which are the two people that Heather's parents were already considering, they're the first people that they wanted to talk to. Apparently, Randy and Josh were actually friends, despite the fact that, Josh had broken bro code by pursuing Randy's ex, who he apparently really cared about. Randy was said to have really liked Heather, even though they broke up. I guess they broke up because he heard that she had gone skinny dipping with some girls and some guys without him, and he didn't really like that, so he broke it off. But even after they broke off, they spent a lot of time together. I guess Randy would come to the house, they'd watch TV, and the two would talk for hours on end on the phone when they were not together. But they didn't really seem to have a spark. That's why they weren't together anymore. They were just better as friends. And the feeling was mutual from both Randy, that's his name, and Heather. So when he ended it, it wasn't a big deal. And since it wasn't a big deal when things ended, that gave Heather the kind of go ahead in her mind to go ahead and pursue Josh. And since it wasn't a big deal on Randy's end, he didn't mind when Josh and Heather were sort of being flirtatious with one another. Apparently, it was just like very chill. They were all three still friends with each other and would even spend time together, the three of them. I guess they had like teenage things in common. They were all kind of on the wild side. So they would hang out, they would party, they would drink, and they would partake in the drugs. More so the boys, but Heather was definitely now, starting to rebel against her family and starting to lean more into these things with these particular friends. But anyways, now hearing these names, police are wanting to talk to Randy and Josh because they're like, okay, these are two people who we have heard their names more than once now. They're two people who could have seen Heather, and they're two people who could have the motive and the opportunity, perhaps, we don't know yet until we talk to them, to have done something to her, is basically what police are thinking. Now, Randy was seen as a good kid. He was somebody who was well known and well regarded in his community. He was a senior and he was the captain of the football team. And football was like a big thing in this area. So that was like a big bonus point for him in the area. And again, he had been homecoming king. He was handsome and he was popular, despite the fact that his family actually didn't have a lot of money. And that's sometimes something that you don't really see with like popular kids, because like, the popular kids are the rich kids. But Randy was said to have been like, his family was struggling pretty bad. He was said to have been, quote, from poverty. And he lived with his grandma, and she did her best to support the two of them. But overall, he was seen as a bright kid and a promising football player in a town that, again, very much valued football players. So I told you all about Randy because the cops sat down with him first, and they asked him if he remembered what he had been doing the night that Heather went missing, which is presumably when she was killed in police's mind. And he said yes, he actually did remember quite well because he had been partying with some friends. Apparently, he had actually been with Josh. Remember how Josh was having a party at his trailer? He had been at this trailer with Josh, which was, Heather's new crush. And they were hanging out. They were having a boys' night. There was another guy there, some guy named Curtis. And the three of them were hanging out. They were drinking. They were playing dominoes. They were, shooting the shit, being guys. And the cops asked, like, okay, well, did you go anywhere? Did you leave? And he said that they left the trailer one time. They went and picked up food. Then they came back. They partied some more. And they all passed out there that night. He told police he did not see Heather and that none of them could have because they were all together the entire night. Because they knew the cops were going to go speak to Josh next. Now, that sounded like a good enough story, but police needed to confirm it. They couldn't very well take his word for it. So they needed to talk to Josh, and they also needed to talk to this Curtis guy and confirm that that was the truth. And since Josh had already, been on their list of people they wanted to talk to, they started with him. Now, Josh, he was also popular like Randy, but he was the popular rich kid in town. His mom was a lawyer, and his grandparents were among the wealthiest landowners in southern Oklahoma. And that left Josh with always having the newest thing and driving the nicest car. Apparently, he went through several cars, and he was only 17 years old, which is insane. He, like Randy, also lived with his grandparents because his mother lived like an hour away. I'm not exactly sure why they didn't live together, but his grandparents were seen as good people. They were seen as anchors in their community, but they didn't really have much structure for Josh, so he was kind of a spoiled brat who had no respect for authority. Like, for example, he got caught, I believe he was allegedly drunk driving and speeding, and he got pulled over and then proceeded to like fight with the cops, like physically fight with the cops, and then just screamed that he wanted his fucking lawyer. Like, he was very like, he's a privileged young man. Let's just say that. So anyways, cops sit down with him. They talk to him with his grandma alongside him, and he tells them the same story that Randy did, that they were together, that they were partying, and his grandma was able to corroborate that. She was like, I was there. They were in the trailer. Well, not there, but I was in my house, and they were in the trailer, travel trailer on my property, and they were partying, and all these boys spent the night. So after speaking to Josh, they wanted to speak to their friend Curtis that they said that they had been with that night. And Curtis was the one person who was kind of an outlier because he was seen as kind of a rough character, okay? He had a bit of a juvie record. He had spent some time in a mental health facility. And it wasn't even like a little record either. I said a record, but like it was a pretty big one. He had been getting in trouble for years. He spent a good amount of time in juvie, and he was the type of guy who apparently like younger guys wanted to hang out with because one, they thought he was cool, but two, you were also a little bit afraid of him because he was literally the type of guy to drive around and shoot people's dogs that were left in their yard and shoot people's cattle. Yeah. And apparently he had even brought like an unloaded gun to school and started waving it around and like threatening teachers. He was just like not a great guy. And he was the type of guy that you could kind of see the lacking in his eyes. Something was just not quite right. But just because there was something off with him, because it did seem like there was something off with him, that didn't mean he was related to what happened to Heather, right? Because they spoke to him and he said the exact same thing the other two had, that they hung out, they drank, they played dominoes, they ate food, they passed out. That was the end of it. So with police's two main people of interest having alibis that were corroborated by more than one person, they kind of had to put them in their back pocket and move on with their day and start looking into new people. And seeing as how Heather was 16 years old herself, it seemed like the best place that they could start would be her school. So they go there with the intention of talking to the staff and talking to the students, and they start with the staff, and they want to see if anybody has seen anything, anyone heard anything, anyone had any information that could be useful. And they speak to all the staff, and this actually does end up being useful because there's one person, this is the athletic director, I believe, who said that they believe they had actually seen Heather the night that she went missing. They said that they had seen her in the early morning hours driving around with two other dudes who had previously graduated from the school. And so he recognized all of them and said that at the time, nothing seemed weird, but now that Heather had been found dead, it was making everything that they had seen it was being looked at through a new lens. They're like, okay, maybe something was going on. So the cops were like, oh shit, we need to speak to these guys. And these guys' names were Jody and Eric. And they start by talking to Jody because it was Jody's truck that this school official had seen the three of them driving around in. So they track this guy down. They speak to him and he says yes. He says yes, he and Eric had been driving around that night, shooting the shit, killing time, because again, there was nothing for young people to do in this town. But he said that Heather was not with them. He was like, I know who Heather is. Like, I know of her, but I don't know her very well. Definitely not well enough to be hanging out with her in the middle of the night. So after speaking to Jody, they go and speak to Eric, and Eric corroborates what Jody said. He says, yes, we were hanging out, but we weren't with Heather. I do know Heather, but she wasn't with us, and I haven't seen her or talked to her since she went missing. Now, cops aren't totally sure that they believe these guys because there was an eyewitness who put Heather in their vehicle with them at a very significant time in the investigation. But as they looked further into these boys, they didn't think that there was anything here. They even talked to one of the boys' girlfriends, I believe it was Eric's girlfriend, and she said that at the time that Heather was receiving that phone call that they believe was used to lure her out of the house, Eric, had been at home, so he couldn't have been in the car and with her and couldn't have lured her out. So given that everything seemed to line up, everything they said seemed to line up, police also put these two dudes in their back pocket and started moving forward to look at other people. So while police are looking at all these people of interest, all these people that they're interested in, they're also conducting interviews and they're gathering evidence. Because remember, there are a lot of different officers working this case. So there are a lot of hands in this pot. And a lot of these officers are hearing one name that's coming up over and over. Like throughout this investigation, one name keeps coming up over and over. And it's the name Craig. Now, Craig isn't any of the ex-boyfriends. He isn't any of the two guys who was seen by an eyewitness, but he is somebody that people know is he's a bad guy, and not just a bad guy because he's not a kid. He's not in high school. He's a bad man. He's a full-blown man with a life and a job and but he's still seen as bad. He was definitely on the wrong side of the law and was known to sell weed and meth to high school kids and was known to sell to Heather. That was the rumor that was going around, is that he sold drugs to Heather and that from being related to this guy, she saw or found out something that she should not have known and was killed for it. So police are like, okay, we're hearing these rumors. We're hearing this guy's name over and over. We should probably bring him in and question him. And so they do. And when they question him, he says that yes, he does know Heather. He is familiar with her. And he admits to police that he had bought booze for her before, though he says that's the extent of it. He says he didn't sell her anything else. He says there's no friendship, there's no relationship, that she's just some teenage girl that he bought booze for once before, and said he hadn't even seen her in weeks. Now, cops too had to verify this, and Craig seemed more than eager to give them his alibi and to have them check into him and rule him out. He basically told them that his alibi was that the night that Heather went missing, he was at home with his mother. He had not gone anywhere. He was at home with his mom. She could confirm that, and said the next day he had gone straight to work. And so cops went, they talked to his mom, they talked to his boss, they talked to his coworkers, and it turned out that that seemed to be true. And even though so many people thought he may be responsible just because of who he was and the drug activity, the cops ruled him out pretty quickly because they were like, we just don't even get the vibe from him that he would be a killer. So with that, it was back to the drawing board. And by back to the drawing board, I mean back to the high school, because they're assuming whoever killed Heather knew her. And most of the people that Heather knew were in high school. So they went back and they were going to be trying to speak to her friends, her peers. But they were finding that there was a little bit of resistance. These kids seemed to be very uninterested in cooperating with police. There seemed to be a distrust there. Now, why did these kids not trust the cops? Pick a reason, you know what I mean? Like, I think there's a lot of reasons why a lot of people don't trust cops. But with this one, what they were thinking the reason was the drug activity in Eureka, because there was quite a bit of it, and they were finding that a lot of teenagers were involved in it because, again, they lived in an area where there was nothing to do. So they would just do what they could to stimulate themselves in a way that they weren't able to find through other means of activity, basically. Now, was that the reason they want to talk to the cops? The reasoning really is irrelevant. The result is the same, and the result was that none of these kids wanted to talk to the cops. So not having much that they could do to make these kids talk, they thought that the best thing that they could do was to open up a tip line. They would make this tip line anonymous so that maybe this would, maybe the appeal of the anonymity would sort of lubricate up the vocal cords and get kids more likely to talk because nobody would know it was them who was talking, kind of thing. Now, this tip line did end up being a successful thing for them to have done. Great. Good sentence. It was a good thing because they were now getting 20 to 30 tips a day. But that also meant that they had 20 to 30 tips a day to track down and verify or exclude. Now, one of these tips that police needed to look into came from a guy named Tyler, and Tyler worked at a marina on Lake Murray in Oklahoma. And he said that the night that Heather went missing, he had seen her, like the early morning hours of the following day, he had seen her. He says he was driving on Interstate 35, and that when he looked in the car next to him, he saw Heather in the car. They were like right next to each other. He looked right at her, and then that car drove faster, and he kind of lost sight of them. Now, in hearing this tip over the phone, they decided that they wanted to go speak to Tyler in person and to get his account of what he saw in person. And once they met with him, they started to get sort of an odd feeling. He seemed very nervous. He seemed very uncomfortable speaking to them. And as they started to push him, they found that his story wasn't making a lot of sense, and they thought he was lying. They started to question him further. They started to push him. And the more that they started to question his story, the more nervous and frazzled he seemed to get. So the police started to think that this guy had inserted himself in the investigation and was giving police information that was just flat out not true. And they had to try to figure out why someone would do something like that. Was he somebody who was just interested in the case and wanted to be involved? Because we do see that happen. Or was he somebody who wanted to give the police some information to throw them off his scent? Because it is so not uncommon for a killer to insert themselves into an investigation to either monitor or mislead. By talking to this man and looking into him, they learned that he knew who Heather was. He was familiar with her. I guess her family had opened a business through the summer at the marina, and that's when he and she met, and he seemed to have become sort of infatuated with her, very interested in her. And police are wondering if maybe he thought that this feeling was mutual, which, knowing Heather, it definitely was not. But they thought that maybe this man had some deluded thoughts, thought that the feeling was mutual, wanted to act out on some sort of fantasy that he had of her or with her, and then after panicked and disposed of her. So they asked this guy to take a polygraph test, and he agreed. And they asked him all the questions you would think he would, if he knew Heather, if he knew what happened to her, if he was responsible for what happened to her. And he failed his polygraph test. As a result, they naturally wanted to look into him more. They wanted to search him. They wanted to search all of his shit. So they ask him for permission to search his truck, and he gives it. And they search his truck, and they don't find anything. They don't find anything that shows that this truck had been near Heather or Heather had been near this truck. So they ask him where he was the night that Heather disappeared, the night Heather was killed. And he says that he was with his father. He was at his father's house. And when they look into his alibi, they find that it is true. He was at his father's house. He was there when the phone call was made. And so there was no way that he would be the person who had lured her out of the house and then presumably killed her. Now, this was very frustrating for police, as I'm sure you can imagine. It's like every single person they looked into, they just had to quickly move on from. It's like we look into these boyfriends, we move on. We look into these two guys that she was in the car with, and we move on. We look into the drug dealer, and now this boat motherfucker, the guy who worked at the marina. And they're just like, Jesus Christ, like everything we go to turns into nothing. And they were so frustrated. Like a lot of these officers had kids that were around the same age as Heather. They had daughters. One even had a daughter who was also a cheerleader. So not having her case solved was incredibly discouraging. And then as more and more time passed, they were just getting farther and farther from finding those answers. And they knew, and like we all know that the first 48 hours are the most important. And they were well past that. And like none of their leads were panning out. But then 19 days after Heather disappeared from her home, police got their first real break, the break that was going to actually lead them towards who did this to Heather. And this break came in the form of a call from a local hardware store. And the person who was calling said that days before Heather was killed, 2 dudes had come into the hardware store and had bought an ammunition. And not just any ammunition. They had bought the exact type of the Winchester buckshot ammo that was used to kill Heather. They had bought like 4 boxes of this stuff. The hardware shop was like, listen, I'm going to give you this. I'm going to tell you that this happened, and I'm going to raise you one by letting you know that I actually have the name of the person who did this. Because apparently the person who came in and actually bought the ammunition, there were 2 dudes, but the one who actually paid used his grandparents' account when purchasing this ammo. And the person who purchased it was a teenage guy named Joshua Bagwell, Heather's most recent beau. So in hearing this, police were like, holy shit. Kind of, but also not really, because turns out they always were sort of, even though they investigated further leads, right? Because they have to go down every path to make sure that their gut feeling is right. Their gut feeling was always pulling them towards that party in that trailer. So you remember how I said that there were 2 dudes who went into this hardware store to buy this ammo. Well, they didn't have the name of the other dude. So they sat down with the person who, had sold the ammo, blah, blah, blah. And they sat them down with like a photo lineup to have them see if there was somebody that they recognized who may or may not have been with Josh at that time. And the person said yes. And the photo that they were like, this is the dude, this is the guy, this is the one, was Curtis Gamble. That was his last name. So we have Josh Bagwell, we have Curtis Gamble. And remember, Curtis is the guy who was supposed to be partying with Josh alongside Heather's ex-boyfriend. That was Randy Wood, the night that Heather went missing. And all of them were like, oh yeah, we didn't see her. But now the cops are like, maybe you did though. And this party at this trailer, by the way, was just a couple of blocks from Heather's house. I didn't mention that yet, but now I am. So police had been looking into these guys, and they had looked into Curtis too, and they found that he owned a shotgun, and that it was a gun that he was very proud to let everybody know that he had. So in learning he had been there when this specific shotgun ammo had been found, the police decided they wanted to talk to him. So they head over to his home, where he also lived with his grandma. A lot of kids here getting to live with their grandmas, which lucky them, that sounds like a treat. But they go and they speak to her, and her name is Rita. And in talking to the cops, she starts to be like, oh shit, because he had said some things to her that at the time were definitely weird. Her grandson had said some things to her at the time that were definitely weird, but now that she's standing there with cops on her porch questioning her about a murder that her grandson may or may not have been involved in, they started to be even weirder statements, right? She said that after Heather went missing, Curtis had mentioned to her that he knew about somebody who had been murdered. And she said that she, like everybody else, was aware of Heather's disappearance and had been watching about it on the news and had actually seen when Heather's body had been found. And she says that when she was watching it on the news, she called out to Curtis, like, hey, that girl who was missing, her body was found. And she said that she knew her grandson had a mean streak in his body because he told her in response, like, I don't give a fuck about that little girl. And what's so sad here is now she has these cops on her porch asking about her grandson in relation to a murder, and she's experiencing horror in two different ways. Because one, the police are suspecting that her grandson may very well be responsible for a murder, which would already be a lot for somebody to process. But two is that she knew firsthand the devastation that murder inflicted on a family. Because apparently, this is crazy, her mother was murdered. She was actually one of the earlier victims of serial killer Henry Lee Lucas. So this is a lot for her to process, but she is very cooperative with police. She's very helpful. And she even gives them some information that is incredibly helpful for them. And that is that the bridge that they believe Heather was killed on, this would have been the Belknap Bridge. That was a bridge that she would often take Curtis to when he was a kid to go fishing. So he was incredibly familiar with the spot where she was murdered. So the cops bring in Curtis again and they question him again about Heather's murder, and he again denies any involvement. They ask him if he'll take a polygraph test and he agrees. He takes one and he fails miserably, so they continue to question him. And they question him for 8 hours. And during this questioning, they ask him about his shotgun. And this is something that, again, led police to believe that they were on the right track, because he's very open about talking about his shotgun because he's very proud of it. And he tells them that it is a Mossberg M9? Question mark? To gun people. But basically the reason that this was irrelevant. No. The reason this was relevant is because in hearing what type of gun he had, the cops were like, yeah, we're onto something, because this particular shotgun could shoot 9 rounds before needing to be reloaded. And if you recall, those shotguns only would shoot 8 rounds, and Heather was shot 9 times. So they ask him about the shotgun shells that were purchased by Josh when he was there. And he admits that, yes, he was there, that, yes, they got shotgun shells together. But he says that they would use this for sport, for target practice, for trying to shoot cute, innocent little frogs. And he's like, listen, I can even prove to you that that's what those bullets were used for, because I can take you to the area where we shot them. So he actually got in the car with the cops and headed to the north side of the Red River. And when he got out with the cops, he showed them, like, this is where we would shoot. And the cops saw that, yes, there were like shell casings all over the place, but they searched it high and they searched it wide, or whatever the saying is. And they found that though there were a lot of casings there, there were none of the Winchester casings there, the bullets that they knew that these fools had purchased and they knew had been used to kill Heather. So while still at the scene, they explain to Curtis what their issue is with what he's saying. They point out the inconsistencies. They basically are like, listen, fucker, like, we know what happened. This is what we think happened. And knowing his goose was effectively cooked, once they got back in the car, he did confess. Well, not just after they got back in the car. It was after they got back in the car. They drove around a little bit longer. They pulled over again and they questioned him again. Like, it took a little bit of time, but he did confess. He told the cops that he may or may not have been involved with what happened to Heather on October 2nd, 1996, and said that his shotgun, which was nicknamed Old Blackie, may or may not have been used to kill her. And eventually he did give a signed confession. So this is what he says happened. He says that the night that Heather was killed, they were in fact at Josh's trailer, and they were in fact partying, drinking, playing dominoes, all that jazz. But he said that Heather was there too. He said sometime during the night, Randy, Heather's ex-boyfriend, had assaulted her. And that after he did it, he started to panic. He started to freak out that because she was kind of like unconscious at the time. He said she was worried. He was worried that she would wake up. She would realize what happened. She would tell somebody what happened and ruin his life. So in response to this and wanting to protect himself, he came up with the idea to take her out to that bridge. And then once they got out there, he killed her. So in response to hearing this story, 3 weeks after Heather was murdered on October 25th, 1996, Curtis Gamble, Josh Bagwell, and Randy Wood were all arrested and charged with the murder of Heather Rich. And though you'll find out that Josh never admitted to what he did, he's the only one who never admits to taking part in what happened, which is, I guess, like a little bit of a spoiler here, but we'll get there. It's clear that this kid has like no conscience whatsoever, because when he was arrested, right, he was arrested and he had been asleep when they took him in, and he was being driven to the police station. The cop was kind of like, oh, you must have had a lot of sleepless nights recently, because like being involved in a murder would presumably weigh on somebody's head. And he responded to this cop, quote, You've just woke me up. Did it look like I was having any trouble sleeping? To which I'm like, what a little dickhead. Now, it was definitely shocking to a lot of the community when these boys/men, eventually 2 men, were arrested for Heather's murder, but it wasn't entirely surprising for her family because they did always sort of suspect Randy from that first day when they called him. And it wasn't because he was a bad kid, because all reports say that he wasn't. It was just sort of that robotic way in which he spoke to them when they called looking for her. And apparently they weren't even the only ones who were suspecting him, because after Heather went missing, started acting weird, and people at the school started to notice that he wasn't like himself. He gave some like little weird interview after he went homecoming king, and his answers weren't like himself. And even the cops from the very first day believed he was responsible, because when they had that first interview with him, when they sat down with him, at the bottom of the page where the cop was like writing his notes, he just wrote the word lie. So anyways, after the arrest, as I said, Josh, he didn't say anything. He lawyered up and he kept his mouth shut. He's like, I haven't confessed. Nobody's saying I even did anything, because remember, Curtis is saying that Randy was the one who was the shooter. And speaking of, Randy, when he learned that Curtis was trying to put the whole thing on him, he decided that he too was going to tell his side of the story, because from his side of the story, it wasn't he who shot and killed Heather. It was Curtis, the guy who didn't actually know her. So here are Randy's versions of events. This is Randy's version of events, okay? He says that the night that Heather went missing, just like what Curtis said, all of them were partying, drinking, having fun, and Heather was there. He said that they were drinking, and at some point, Heather and Josh started to like make out, because remember, they were kind of into each other. And so Randy and Curtis decided to leave and give them some privacy. They drove around a little bit, trying to kill time, apparently trying to look for some other girls who they did not find, and then eventually went back to the trailer. When they got back, Heather was reportedly very, very drunk. There had been like a full bottle of alcohol that was mostly gone by this point, and it was clear that she and Josh had been intimate because they were both mostly undressed. And according to Randy, when he got back, Heather was very, very upset. She said that she was upset because she felt like she had betrayed Randy by hooking up with Josh, because she and Randy had never been intimate before. He says he talked to her, he tried to calm her down, and by that time she was so drunk that she was barely conscious. So he says that those 3 boys then stood around and had a discussion about whether or not to assault her while she was unconscious. Randy says that even he considered it. He said that he had been in the room with her and he did undress and he did fondle her, but said that she was like coming in and out of consciousness and like crying and kind of screaming and whimpering. So he decided against it. He says that Curtis did, however, go in and do something with Heather, though later Curtis would say that he was unable to perform. Randy says that whenever Curtis was done doing what he had done to Heather, he left her alone in the room, passed out, undressed. She was just in there, and went back out into the main area, and that the 3 boys continued drinking. And after a while, Heather had woke up and started like crying and screaming again. She apparently continued to do this. And when she did it after Curtis had already, been in the room with her, he started to freak out. He said that Curtis started to freak out and started to panic and said that he wouldn't be going to jail for that type of assault. Like, he wasn't going to do it. That just wasn't going to be an option. And then said that in order to cover up his tracks, they needed to kill her. And Randy says that at first he thought that Curtis was just all talk, being a tough guy. But then he pulled out his shotgun, and Randy believed what he was saying was true. So the boys dressed Heather, they put her in the back of Josh's truck, and then they proceeded to drive. And at first, Josh was driving towards Curtis's house, so Randy started to get this feeling that what Curtis was saying wasn't true, that it was going to be fine, and that they were just going to drop Curtis off, and that everything was going to be fine. But then after some time, Josh drove instead to his grandfather's property, like some property that they own. Remember, they were big landowners, and they were talking about leaving her body there. And Curtis vetoed this idea, saying that if they were to put her there, that this could at some point be linked back to them. So they pulled over at some point, and Curtis took over as the driver. And now he drove them across the border into Texas, specifically to that bridge that he was very well aware of. Once there, Curtis grabbed the shotgun, and Josh and Randy took Heather out of the truck and put her on the bridge, where he says that she was so drunk that she just like slumped over, having no idea what was going on. She was just like not conscious. And Randy says that the only reason that he did this, the only reason he took her out and put her on the bridge, is because he thought that if he disobeyed or tried to disagree with Curtis, he would kill him too. He said after putting her on the bridge, he got back in the truck. He says he knew what was going to happen, so he just sat there with like his hands covering his face and waited until he heard shots. He heard one, and then he heard several more, and after a couple of minutes, he started to feel sick. So he got out of the truck, and when he did, he saw that Curtis was in a daze because of what he did, and then he looked over to Heather and just saw a hole where her face had once been because she had been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun. And he later said of this sight, quote, "Death's got its own face. It's unlike anything else." He said while he was standing out there after Heather had been killed, Josh went and he got a rock so that he could weigh the body down, and then he tied it to one of Heather's shoelaces. He said the three of them then pushed her body into the river, proceeded to pick up all the shotgun shells. They put dirt over the blood to try to hide what they did, and then they went home with the plans to act like nothing ever happened. And Randy said the next day he had Heather's cheerleading jacket. It was this maroon and white like Letterman jacket, and he says that he burned it to get rid of any evidence. Now, police seem to believe Randy's version of events and not Curtis's. They believe that he was much more truthful, much more incriminating of himself as opposed to how Curtis was. And they did give him a polygraph test as well. And he did pass. Now, Curtis was the one of these three men who didn't know Heather, right? He was the one who didn't have a motive, or at least not an outward motive, to want to have her dead like this. But police looked into him, okay, because they wanted to figure out why he may have done this, and they found something. They looked into all of them, to be fair, but right now specifically we're talking about Curtis, and they looked into him because remember he had been in juvie a lot. Well, when they looked into his past, they found something very damning, and that is that years before Heather was killed, when he was arrested previously, he had talked about having a fantasy of wanting to assault and murder a girl. He talked about wanting to do this specifically. So they believe that they were onto something in trusting Randy and believing that it was Curtis, not Randy, who was the trigger man here. And dude, later when this case went to trial, there was this guy who was a military policeman who worked as like a guard at the juvie center where Curtis had been in 1992. He said that Curtis had said that his ultimate fantasy would be to commit a crime that would shock the nation. He said that Curtis's ultimate fantasy was to take a girl, to assault her, and then to, quote, blow her head off. So here's what police believe happened that night. They believe that the men were having their party night, as they said. They were drinking. They were playing dominoes. Eventually, they wanted to get food and more whiskey, so they drove and they got some. And while out, Josh called Heather and told her to come over to the trailer and party with them. And Heather was very happy to go because she liked Josh, and this would have been their first date. They believe that she then snuck out of her house so that she could meet Josh, walked the few blocks over to that party, and then everything Randy said was true, that Randy and Curtis left so that Josh and Heather could be alone, and then Josh would have taken advantage of her, because there's a question of consent because we don't know. But I think it's safe to say that if a girl is so drunk that she can't keep her eyes open and or stand and talk, then she can't give consent. And that then the men came back. They both attempted to or did assault her as well, and then panicked that she could tell somebody what happened. They took her to that bridge where Curtis murdered her. He shot her over and over until that shotgun was empty, and then they just dumped her in the water. Now, even though Heather was from Oklahoma and kidnapped from Oklahoma, she was killed in Texas, so that's where the trial was going to take place, which is incredibly inconvenient for her entire family to have to make that trek, but it just is what it is, right? And so that's where the trials were going to be, and all three boys were being tried as adults. And the prosecution was going after life sentences for both Josh and Randy, and the death sentence for Curtis because he was the trigger man. And this was something that Heather's family agreed with. Now, because there were 3 men who were responsible for what happened here, and because 2 of the men were giving conflicting stories and one wasn't confessing at all, it was going to be difficult for the prosecution to secure the convictions if they went for first-degree murder on all 3, because there are 3 people, there's no way to know which one did what conclusively, right? You can try to build a case, but there's always that reasonable doubt because there was more than one person there, and how do you know who's lying, right? So they knew it was going to be difficult. So they were going to be offering some plea deals. Now, the first person they went to is Randy, because Randy is the one who had been the most helpful, and they believe that he was the least culpable. So basically, they were offering him a deal where he would get life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years instead of the automatic life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years if he was to testify against Josh, and he agreed. Now, for some reason, they also offered a plea deal to Curtis. And I say for some reason, though I know what the reason is, and that's that they thought that the only way they were actually going to be able to get a conviction against Josh was if they had both Randy and Curtis to testify against him. Now, this was obviously something that had to be considered. It was something that they asked Heather's parents about, and it's something that they had to think about for 2 days before finally coming back and agreeing that having Josh in custody too and having him behind bars as well was more important than Curtis losing his life. And Heather's mother, Gail, said of this decision, and I quote, "I told Curtis I have no mercy, no sympathy for him. But I told him I was going to give him his life so he would help us. I want all of them to see justice. I want Josh to get equal justice. I want that very, very bad." So they offered Curtis life in prison instead of the death penalty. They were taking the death penalty off the table. And what he had to do in exchange for this was to testify at Josh's trial and admit that he was the trigger man, that Curtis was the trigger man, and that Josh knew what was happening, that he was complicit. And Curtis agreed. And I don't know, man, this is one of those cases where, like, should he have been offered a plea deal? Should he have been put to death? I'm definitely thankful that he's off the streets because, like, he didn't even know Heather. He did this without knowing her. And he seemed to be the type of guy that just, like, could not keep himself in control because apparently in court, the bailiff, like, put his hand on Curtis to guide him in a direction. And before anyone knew it, Curtis had the bailiff on the ground and was choking him out. And a Texas Ranger literally had to put his arm around Curtis's throat to try to stop him. And Curtis only stopped choking this guy when he himself passed out. Anyways, in February of 1998, nearly a year and a half after Heather was murdered, and now 19-year-old Josh Bagwell went to trial. And unlike his friends who just had public defenders, he had 2 fancy, expensive attorneys at his disposal because his family had a lot of money. And the defense's tactic here was basically to try to assassinate Heather's character. They wanted to do everything in their power to make the jury less sympathetic towards a 16-year-old girl who was murdered, and basically said that Josh would never have had to assault or kill Heather because she would have been willing. Yeah. Heather's mother took the stand and she talked about the last time that she saw her daughter, and she also had to try to defend her daughter's honor, which is such a sad thing to have to do. She said that yes, her daughter had made some mistakes. She had experimented with drugs and had experimented with alcohol, but said she was also an honors student who was a wonderful person. And this defense attorney, man, he had the audacity to say to this woman whose daughter was murdered, quote, "She was your perfect child, but she wasn't quite perfect, right?" Who raised you? Truly. And it was just like a particularly bold thing to claim, especially since being arrested and while Josh was in jail awaiting trial, he was anything but perfect. Apparently, while in jail, he had literally tried to incite a riot. He had threatened to kill several guards. He attacked a cop, and he tried to carve a whole ass hole through his cinder block wall a la Andy Dufresne, and went on to get a bunch of racist tattoos on his arms like swastikas and white power symbols whilst in jail. The fuck? But anyways, the defense tried to claim that Josh was forced into this murder plot against his will, had no idea what was going on, and said that it was Randy, not Curtis, who had killed Heather. This is what he's saying. So now Curtis is going to take the stand. And remember, Curtis is getting on the stand for the prosecution, and he's supposed to tell them about how he was the killer, how he was the shooter, and how, Josh knew what was going on and all that jazz. But, dude, when he got on the stand, he totally changed his tune. It's just crazy because you remember his whole plea deal. Like, the only way he got it is if he got on that stand and told the truth. And now here he was completely changing it. He's like, it was Randy who killed Heather, not me. And Josh had no idea what was going on. Neither of us did. We were just blind little kids. Just, oh my God, this is happening and we're just here. This is what he's saying. So he's completely throwing away his plea deal. And though this could seem like such a damning thing for the prosecution, they were like, actually, we were kind of fine with it because we knew if he was on the stand, he was so unbelievable. He was so unbelievable. So we knew that they would immediately, like the jury would just know that this guy was a liar and he was the shooter. And, I'm not sure exactly what Curtis thought he was doing with this. I'm sure he thought he ate. He probably thought he was really doing something, but this ended up backfiring on him because he didn't get his plea deal and then would go on to be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and get 2 life sentences for what he did, which is a spoiler alert. Let's just say that's what happened with Curtis. We're not going to talk about him anymore because he is crazy and scary. But I just what was he thinking that he was doing? What a silly bitch. But anyways, that was a big shock to the prosecution, as I'm sure you can imagine. Whether it was good for them or bad for them, it was shocking because one of their main witnesses who had made a plea deal to literally testify against Josh had backed out. And he wouldn't be the only one, dude. He would not be the only one who was going to back out because Randy was also going to back out of his plea deal, but it's not what you think. What Curtis did was to try to hurt the prosecution, right? But what Randy would go on to do was to try to help. The night before Randy was set to testify against Josh, he pulled out of his plea deal. But that didn't mean that he wasn't going to testify, okay? He pulled out of his plea deal so that when he did testify, and he did, nobody would question why he was testifying. He didn't want anyone to think that he was lying to save himself. He wanted them to know that he was telling the truth. Now, this is nearly unheard of because basically what he was going to be doing was going to be testifying and implicating himself with 0 protection, which meant that he could be sentenced to capital murder. He could be convicted of capital murder, which could come with a death sentence. And his attorney said that though this was very noble from a moral standpoint, from a legal standpoint, it was very stupid. Now, Heather's parents, as I'm sure you can imagine, were stunned. They were stunned that he made this decision, and they actually did sit down and meet with him. He requested to meet with them. This was after he testified against Josh. Spoiler alert, but I already told you that's what happened. And he sat down and he spoke to them, and it was a filmed interview, and it was aired on TV in 1998. In this interview, he told them how sorry he was and how much he wished he could have done something different. And they said they believed him and said that they knew he didn't have to do what he did, but they were grateful that he did. And Gail has said that one of the reasons that she wanted to meet him was that she could look at his eyes and that he could see that she had no hatred for him in her eyes. And she wanted him to know that she believes his testimony made the difference in what ended up happening in Josh's trial. And Randy, man, he said of this decision that he made, quote, "I knew I was making things worse for myself. There was no way I could testify without incriminating myself, but I thought it was the right thing to do." Ultimately, Randy did get up on that stand. He told his version of events. He implicated himself with no protection, and he told the court that Curtis was the one who killed Heather and that Josh was there. He was complicit in the murder, and he was complicit in the cover-up after the fact. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this was very strong testimony, and he just sounded so much more believable with what he said than what Josh said. Because what Josh said was that he had nothing to do with any of it. He said he wasn't even in the trailer when Curtis and Randy discussed the idea of killing Heather, but he said that Randy was the one who wanted her dead, that Randy was the one who wanted to have sex with her, but she didn't want to, so he was pissed. So Randy was the one that killed her, but he said that since he wasn't there when the conversation happened, he didn't even know it was happening. He says when he got in the truck that night with all of them, he thought they were just driving around to sober her up, and that he wasn't even there when she was killed. He had walked off to take a pee. He went off to take a pee. And when he came back, she was already dead. And he said he didn't even help with the cover-up. He said, well, Randy and Curtis threw her body in the water. He just stood there and jumped up and down and looked at his feet and did nothing. Which just doesn't sound true. You know what I mean? And dude, this fool, this is the most delicious part when it comes to his trial. Okay, because he's sitting here saying that he had no idea what happened, that he walked off to pee when the shots were fired, right? But then he said, okay, on the stand, that when he was coming back from going pee, he watched, quote, Curtis lower Randy lower the gun. Delicious. And bro, I just cannot even imagine what it must have been like to be in that trial at that moment, because we don't know. The trial wasn't recorded. The only people the media was only able to film like after they came out of the trial, like in the hallways and stuff. So we don't know what the tension was like in that room. But can you even imagine that moment that just showed that Curtis and Josh were such fucking liars? Anyways, the jury was sent to deliberate, and they came back with their decision on February 14th, Valentine's Day. And they had found Josh guilty. He was guilty of the murder. He was guilty of the conspiracy to commit murder. And he was given life in prison plus 99 years. As the verdict was read, Heather's mother, Gail, who was wearing one of Heather's jacket, took this necklace she was wearing that had a ring on it and started to kiss it. And it turned out that this is the ring that Heather had been wearing on her body when she died, the ring her father used to identify her body. Now, Josh's mother, she was upset. Her name was Charisse. She was upset. She was furious. She said that she accused the prosecution of misconduct. She said that the jury didn't follow the jury instructions, and said that her son is no angel, but he's not a murderer. This is very surprising for his family. I will say that. They were so sure he was going to get off that while the jury was deliberating, they went up and picked up his sports car so that he could drive it home after the trial was done. And man, I just don't know about his family. Well, I have some thoughts, but like, okay. They didn't seem to have any regret or remorse or like compassion for Heather's family at all, considering it seemed very clear that their family member, that Josh, was responsible. And evidence of this is that before Josh was led away, Gail was able to speak to him, right? And she told him how she hopes that he had to think about Heather every single day. And as she is making this tearful statement about her murdered daughter, his family just gets up and starts leaving. They don't even sit and listen. They interrupt her by doing this. And she turns to Josh and says, by your family leaving right now, I completely understand why you are the way that you are. And then she added, quote, you haven't ever had to pay for the mistakes you made, but you're going to now. You took away the most important thing in our life. And listen, we're going to get more into Josh's family, specifically his mother, in just like a little bit. But I will just say, for a little teaser, Gail really seems to be onto something, okay? She does. 6 months after Josh went to trial, Randy went to trial himself. And prior to going to the trial, the prosecution actually did like everything in their power to help him, which is like not their job. You know what I mean? They were so nervous about him going to trial because of the way he implicated himself. And they wanted to try to give him a plea deal where he would get less than life in prison, basically. But he refused to do so. He said that he would not admit to taking part in killing Heather because he only did what he did because he was scared for his own life. He said he didn't pull the trigger. He didn't plan to have Heather killed. He didn't want her killed. Nothing. And he said specifically of this quote, you can look it up in the dictionary, and murder says to take someone's life. And I didn't do that. But the thing is, in Texas, if you are complicit to a murder, legally speaking, it's just as bad as committing the murder. And he was legally complicit, right? He was there. He helped put her in the truck. He helped cross the border and take her to that bridge and help take her out. So it was, the prosecution was like, bro, let me help you. And he just wouldn't do it. And this was complicated, man. It was complicated for the prosecution, who had to do their job. It was complicated for Heather's family because Gail had some sort of sympathy for him. It doesn't seem like Dwayne did, but like Gail did. And she said of this quote, I am pulled both ways. I don't know what I want. If they find him guilty, I'll cry for Randy. If they find him innocent, then I'll feel like justice wasn't done. Ultimately, after a 3-day trial, Randy Wood was found guilty of the capital murder of Heather Rich and was given an automatic life sentence with the possibility of parole after 40 years when he is 57 years old, which will be like 3 times as long as he had been alive at this point. And he did say that he planned to appeal. That is something that he wanted to do, but said that as bad as prison was, nothing could be as bad as what he experienced the night Heather was killed. Randy said he thinks about Heather every day and that what he was part of haunts him. The prosecution said that he didn't want to give Randy such a harsh sentence. Like, this didn't feel like justice, but he said that Randy left him no choice. And he said of this quote, "It was not a moment of celebration. There was no joy or happiness. I had a deep, deep sense that another young life had been senselessly wasted." Now, Heather's mom has said that she believes Randy did deserve to serve some time. She's like, he was there. He let my daughter lie in a creek dead for a week and he didn't tell me. So he deserves to serve time, but she didn't think he deserved to pay with the rest of his life. Though she does say that Josh and Curtis deserve to be dead. Now, Josh never did admit to being involved in this murder, though it does seem very clear that he was. I mean, he was there when the bullets were purchased. It was his truck that was used to take her across the border. It just seems very clear he was responsible, though he just always claimed that he wasn't. And he did try to appeal. He tried to say that he shouldn't have been convicted of capital murder because it could only be capital murder if Heather was kidnapped, and she couldn't be kidnapped because she was unconscious when taken across the bridge. That's what he said, which is just like a very rich statement, and this appeal was denied. They believe that Josh was fully complicit. They were like, bro, you knew it was going to happen and you did nothing to stop it. And they believe that Curtis was, again, the driving factor, the instigator. And they just think that Randy didn't have the balls to stand up to them. That's what the general consensus is from the police when it comes to this case. Now listen, even though Josh tried to appeal and was unsuccessful, that's not to say that he didn't get out of prison. At least for a short while, because get this, you're not going to believe this, but both Josh and Curtis escaped. They escaped the prison. Well, the jail. They escaped jail. Apparently, this was Curtis's second attempt at escape, but it was his first successful escape. So apparently, Curtis, Josh, and two other inmates, this was a girl named Crystal Soto and a guy named Charles Jordan, who were both facing capital murder charges in a double homicide, were able to escape the Montague County Jail after overpowering two guards and stealing a police car. Apparently, they were captured like weeks later at a convenience store in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And apparently what happened is the FBI received a tip that one of the fugitives was seen using a payphone outside. So the cops rushed over and they quickly grabbed the two other people. This was Crystal and what was that guy's name? Charles. Crystal and Charles quickly grabbed them, but then Josh and Curtis, who were inside, saw what happened and grabbed the owner of the convenience store, because he was like the only one working at the time, and held him hostage at like gunpoint, I believe. They held this guy hostage for like 6 hours because they were first like encountered by police at 10 p.m. and didn't surrender until 4 a.m. And you know what's so gross? This is kind of an aside, but I feel like you should know. Apparently these dudes, while they were like on the run and escaped from jail, they were living in the woods near the river where they had put Heather's body. Now, they were caught, but when they first escaped, dude, this was so devastating for Gail and for Dwayne. Like, them getting out brought back all of the feelings that they felt when they first found out that their daughter was dead. And before they were caught, they were also really, really afraid that these two dudes would go on to kill somebody else because they were such dangerous guys. But they were caught before they could hurt anybody else, like physically at least. And you know what's so crazy here? There's even a little bit more to this. It's even more of a twist. And that's that Joshua Bagwell's mom helped them escape. You remember how, like, when he was convicted, she was like, my son's no angel, but he's no murderer? Well, she must have really believed that because she helped these fools escape. She even went as far as, like, getting a man to help her and got them, like, semi-automatic weapons and cell phones and camping gear and maps so that Curtis and Josh could truly escape. Now, what's crazy here, the way she got caught, is because apparently the dude that she was trying to commission to help her was actually Randy's brother. I think his name was Rick. I got half of that wrong. It was Curtis's brother, and his name was Rick. So she's talking to Rick, and he's like, yeah, absolutely, I will help you with that. Click. 911, hello police, and like tells them everything that's going on. He was not down to help with that sickness. Tells them everything that's going on, and then ends up working with them to call her back and get her on recording talking about the escape plans. Apparently, even after they got caught, right? They got caught from trying to escape. She hadn't figured out that they were onto her, and she was still representing her son as his attorney. So he gets picked up after trying to escape, and she still tries to help him escape further by trying to smuggle in hacksaw blades inside of Bibles. Okay, and she was able to do this again because she was there working as his attorney. Well, she's not an attorney anymore, I'm sure. Anyways, she got caught, pled not guilty at first, but then she saw all the evidence against her and ended up changing her plea to guilty to assisting in the escape and conspiracy to commit a felony with a firearm. And she was given a 20-year sentence with all but 8 deferred. It's just so crazy, man. It's crazy how so many people's lives were affected and ruined by this incredibly horrific and pointless and vicious act. And it just breaks my heart to think about what Heather's last moments were like. Like, Randy has given several interviews and he has said that she had no idea what was going on. He said that she wasn't conscious, she wasn't coherent on the bridge, even back at the trailer when what was happening to her was happening to her. He says that she wasn't really there and that when she was killed, she never had a chance to see it coming. It's like, even if that's true, it's so incredibly upsetting. And it was it was too much for her parents. It was too much for them to handle. Like, for a little where are they now moment, like Gail and Dwayne, her parents really had trouble dealing with this. The pain was too great. They ended up divorcing. They both moved away and they have both since died, which it's like, that's incredibly sad. But then I also think about the idea of them still being here if any of these men were to ever get paroled, and how painful that would be. Or, well, any of them except for Randy, since he is the one of them that they seem to be a little bit softer on. And as for Randy, when it comes to like the where are they now situation, he did always have the plan to appeal, and he has tried, but he is still in prison. While being in prison, he did actually get married. He said he never believed he'd have the opportunity, but the woman he married actually learned about his case by watching a documentary on Heather's case, and she felt so sad that someone that young could be sentenced to life imprisonment. She said for a month she couldn't get it out of her head, so she just felt like she had to write him. And Larissa, that's her name, by the way, she was from New Zealand, and she literally moved to Texas to be closer to him, and they got married, and she's just waiting for him to be free. And as of now, it seems that she's just gonna have to continue waiting, and it's one of those things where it feels so unfortunate, because if he had taken the plea deal he was offered, he'd probably be out by now, or at least be like up for the opportunity for parole soon. Like, it would have been right around now. It's just incredibly sad. I think that the prosecution was right when they said it was just like so many young lives wasted. And I mean, at least Randy does get to be alive. He is in jail, right? Or in prison, rather. He is in prison, but he does get to have a life. He does get to experience love in that way of having a wife. And these are all things that Heather never got to experience because at 16 years old, it's just so sad, because I think about a 16-year-old girl and it's like, what are you dreaming of? You're dreaming of exactly that, of that kind of love and of being wanted and being cared for. And she was just used and abused in those last moments. And I think it's so horrific. And I think that that's the biggest takeaway, is that we need to remember Heather, and what's happening with Randy and him being in jail could be seen as tragic as well, definitely. And I think that that's valid. But I think that the most tragic thing of all is the fact that this young girl's life was stolen before it even got a chance to really begin. And with that, my friends, is the story of the murder of Heather Rich. I hope that it was informative. I hope I gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I just want to thank you for hanging out and remembering Heather with me today. Now, considering everything I told you throughout this video, I'd like to revisit the question of the day. If you recall, the question of the day was this: who do you believe was the mastermind, the shooter in this case? Do you believe Randy and that it was Curtis? Or do you believe Curtis and that it was Randy? It's one of those ones that I know there are people who believe both sides, because Randy is the one that seemed to have more of a motive. But I don't know, Curtis seemed like a real evil dick. So you let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, because I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Before you leave, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below, along with a link to my merch store and a link to my membership, which I've recently made all the more accessible. If you didn't already know, what you are seeing with your eyes and what you're hearing with your ears is also a podcast now. It's True Crime with Bratterstein, anywhere that you get podcasts, Spotify, all that jazz. So if you are interested and you want to go and listen, download, interact in whatever way one interacts with a podcast, I'd appreciate it. But if you don't want to, that's fine. I just want to thank you for being here. And now with all that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. I hope to see you in my next video. And in the meantime, take care of yourself.